It was a crisp, ordinary morning in the courthouse, and Judge Thomas Ellis, a man known for his punctuality and strict adherence to the law, was already sitting at the bench, preparing for the day's cases. The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paperwork. As the door opened and a woman stepped inside, Judge Ellis barely glanced up. He had a full docket to get through, and he didn't have time for anything out of the ordinary. Lieutenant Colonel Angela Harris, dressed in her crisp military uniform, entered the room with the kind of quiet confidence that came with years of service in the U.S. military. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back, and her posture was perfect. But it was her eyes, focused and steady, that revealed something more than just her military rank. They revealed a woman accustomed to leadership, to responsibility, to taking command. Judge Ellis, still not looking up, motioned for her to take a seat. He had already glanced at her case file, which noted a minor traffic violation, a speeding ticket issued while Harris was en route to an important military meeting. It seemed like a simple case, nothing unusual, no need for special attention. He noted her uniform and assumed, like many before him, that she was a civilian employee, perhaps a secretary or an office worker from the base. "Miss Harris, you're here today because of a speeding violation," Judge Ellis said, still not meeting her eyes. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, already preparing for the standard exchange. "I see you were going 10 miles over the limit. How do you plead?" Harris straightened in her seat, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I'm guilty of the violation. I was on my way to a military briefing, and I admit I was in a rush." She spoke clearly, without hesitation, her words measured and respectful. Judge Ellis nodded, half listening. It wasn't uncommon for people to offer excuses about being late. He waved off her explanation with a casual flick of his hand, assuming it was just another simple case of someone trying to explain away their mistake. "I understand, but being late doesn't excuse speeding. You'll have to pay the fine," he said, already moving on. $150. "Please make sure this doesn't happen again." Harris nodded silently, acknowledging the fine, but inside she felt a quiet surge of frustration. She had worked her way up the ranks through years of dedication, discipline, and sacrifice, and yet here she was, treated as if she were no different from anyone else in the courtroom. A minor speeding violation, yes, but the lack of recognition for her service stung. As the judge moved on to the next case, Harris stood up, collected her things, and left the courtroom without a word. The judge didn't look back. To him, it was just another case in another day. But to Harris, it was a reminder of how easily her accomplishments, and her very identity, could be overlooked by those who didn't take the time to look deeper. As Lieutenant Colonel Angela Harris walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the situation didn't quite settle in on her shoulders. She had been in situations before where people had underestimated her, where they hadn't recognized her true position or the scope of her work. But each time, she carried herself with the same level of dignity. Her focus was on the mission, not on the misconceptions of others. She had bigger things to worry about than the misjudgment of a civilian judge. Judge Thomas Ellis, on the other hand, didn't give her a second thought. To him, the exchange had been routine. He'd heard 100 similar excuses from defendants, and his ruling had been consistent with his standard approach. Follow the rules, pay the fine, and move on. He hadn't fought to inquire further about her life, her background, or what brought her before him that day. He had assumed the woman in front of him was just another person caught in a routine violation, someone without any extraordinary responsibilities. As Harris exited the courthouse, she made her way to her car parked a few blocks away. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the meeting she was rushing to attend. It was important. She was set to brief military officials on upcoming legal reforms, but she pushed the irritation of the fine out of her mind. She had learned long ago to pick her battles. What mattered most now was getting to that briefing on time. Back in the courtroom, Judge Ellis flipped through the next case file, already focused on the new defendant in front of him. The courtroom buzzed with a low hum as people came and went. The day was moving along at its usual pace, with Judge Ellis presiding over each case with the mechanical precision of someone who had been doing it for years. His mind was on the law, not on the people who appeared before him. What he didn't know was that outside the courthouse, word of the incident was beginning to spread. A military officer who knew Harris personally had heard about the fine. This officer, a senior member of the same military branch, was shocked by the news. "You're kidding," the officer said when they first heard about it. "Lieutenant Colonel Harris. The judge fined her." "No way." The officer immediately contacted a few others within the military legal community, and soon the information made its way to higher-ranking officials. The realization was swift and staggering. Angela Harris wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just a soldier or a civilian employee. She was a leader, a trailblazer in the military justice system, and one of the highest-ranking officers in her division. The more people spoke about it, the more the story seemed almost unbelievable. Harris, who had shaped military law and led others with unyielding integrity, had just been fined for something as trivial as speeding by a judge who hadn't even bothered to recognize her. The gravity of the situation began to sink in, and whispers of disbelief turned into a rising sense of disbelief and outrage. What had been a simple traffic case to Judge Ellis had now become something much larger, an issue of respect, recognition, and authority. Back at her office, Harris sat down to prepare for her meeting, unaware of the stir her brief courtroom appearance was about to create. The news spread like wildfire through the military community. Word of the incident didn't take long to reach Lieutenant Colonel Harris's colleagues and superiors. As more people learned that the woman who had been fined in civilian court was, in fact, one of the highest-ranking officers in military justice, the shock and disbelief grew. It started with a colleague who had heard the story over the phone. Lieutenant Colonel James Walker, a close associate of Harris, was the first to learn of the fine. He had known Harris for years, admired her leadership, and witnessed her tireless work in reforming military law. When he heard that she had been fined by a judge in a routine traffic case, he couldn't believe it. "Wait a minute. You're telling me Judge Ellis fined Angela Harris?" The same Angela Harris who led the military legal reform task force? Walker asked, almost incredulously, to the officer who had brought the news. "Yes," the officer replied, still stunned. "The very same. They said it was a speeding ticket, and the judge just fined her like any other person. Didn't even bat an eye." Walker's jaw dropped. He knew the history of Harris's career, how she had worked her way up through the ranks, how she had fought for fairness and equality within the military justice system. She wasn't just any officer. Harris had been a key player in crafting the guidelines that governed military law, ensuring justice was served across the armed forces with both rigor and compassion. She was the highest-ranking officer in her division, a legal expert trusted with some of the most crucial military cases. To see her treated as an anonymous defendant in a civilian court was a stark reminder of how easy it was for even the most accomplished individuals to be overlooked. Without wasting another moment, Walker reached out to others within the military community. Within hours, the news reached higher-ranking officers and military leaders. Conversations shifted from routine matters to a collective sense of disbelief. How could this have happened? How could Judge Ellis, someone who had presumably spent years on the bench, fail to recognize a leader of Harris's caliber? It wasn't just an oversight. It was a missed opportunity to honor someone who had dedicated their life to service. The more the news spread, the more the military community became incensed. Harris wasn't just another person in a courtroom. She was a trailblazer. And now, to see her treated as if her status and accomplishments didn't matter was, to many, a slap in the face to all women and people of color who had broken barriers in the military. As her colleagues rallied around her, Harris remained unaware of the storm brewing on her behalf. She sat in her office, preparing for the briefing she had been rushing to attend earlier. Her thoughts were focused on the task at hand. She was, after all, a woman of action, not one to dwell on the petty misunderstandings of others. But the brewing storm was quickly catching up with her, and soon she would learn that the minor courtroom incident had turned into something much more significant than she could have ever expected. The shockwaves from the courtroom incident continued to ripple through the military community. What had seemed like a minor oversight by Judge Ellis was slowly morphing into a larger conversation about respect, recognition, and assumptions. Colleagues of Lieutenant Colonel Angela Harris, upon hearing the news, were not only surprised but deeply offended on her behalf. To many, this wasn't just about a small mistake. It was about the failure to acknowledge someone of Harris's extraordinary caliber. In military circles, Harris was a well-known figure. As one of the highest-ranking officers in military justice, her responsibilities were vast. She had overseen important legal reforms, ensuring fairness and accountability within the military justice system, and had played a pivotal role in reviewing high-profile cases. To see her treated like any other civilian in a courtroom was hard to reconcile with the woman they all knew. Someone whose achievements had earned her not just respect, but admiration across the service. Lieutenant Colonel James Walker, who had been one of the first to learn about the fine, couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He had worked with Harris for years and seen firsthand how dedicated she was to her job and to the integrity of military law. When he called her that afternoon to discuss the incident, his voice was tight with frustration. "Angela, I don't know if you've heard, but you're all over the place. The story about the judge and the fine, it's spreading fast, and people are pissed," he said, his words blunt but filled with concern. Harris, still unaware of the extent of the situation, sighed as she listened to Walker. "I've heard nothing about it. What's the problem?" "The problem is that Judge Ellis didn't know who you were," Walker continued. "He fined you like you were just any other person off the street. Angela, you're the highest-ranking officer in military justice. He should have recognized you. This isn't just about a speeding ticket. It's about respect, and I think people are starting to get really upset." Harris was quiet for a moment, reflecting on what Walker was saying. It wasn't about the fine itself. It was about the underlying issue of not being seen for who she truly was. She had spent her career navigating a system that wasn't always kind to women or people of color, and yet she had earned her position through hard work and merit. But this felt different. It wasn't just a misstep. It was a missed opportunity for recognition. "Look, James," Harris said after a pause, "I don't need anyone's pity. I'm not looking for anyone to fight my battles for me. But I do understand why this is getting attention now. It's not just about me. It's about how quickly people are willing to dismiss the contributions of someone they don't understand." Walker could hear the quiet resolve in her voice. He knew Harris well enough to understand that she wouldn't allow this to define her. Still, there was an unmistakable tone of frustration, one that wasn't about self-pity, but about the larger message being sent. And that message wasn't just about a fine. It was about the constant challenge of being seen and heard when others overlook you because of assumptions. "I get it," Walker said, "but this isn't over yet. You might want to prepare for a few calls. There are a lot of people who want to make sure this never happens again." As Harris sat back in her chair, she felt the weight of the situation. She had always done her job quietly, with grace, but now, for the first time in a long while, the spotlight was on her. And this time, it wasn't just about military justice. It was about breaking the boundaries of what people thought they knew. As the day wore on, the news of Lieutenant Colonel Angela Harris's fine continued to spread, and Judge Thomas Ellis found himself caught in the midst of an unexpected storm. At first, he hadn't fully grasped the significance of the case. He had seen countless defendants in his courtroom, each with their own excuses and explanations for their infractions. Harris had been just one of many, and he had treated her as such, nothing more than a defendant in a routine traffic case. But the more Ellis heard about the woman he had fined, the more he realized how wrong he had been. A colleague, a fellow judge with some familiarity with military matters, was the first to break the news to him. "Do you know who you just fined this morning?" The other judge asked, voice tinged with disbelief. Ellis frowned, not understanding the question. A woman named Angela Harris. She was late for a briefing, so I fined her for speeding. What's the big deal? The other judge's tone grew more serious. Angela Harris is not just any woman. She's Lieutenant Colonel Harris, the highest-ranking military justice officer in her division. She's a key figure in the military's legal framework, someone who has helped shape the policies that govern military law. You didn't just fine a civilian. You fined one of the most respected officers in the armed forces. The words hit Ellis like a ton of bricks. His mind raced back to the courtroom. Her calm, composed demeanor, her military uniform that he had assumed was nothing more than a costume. He had missed all the signs. He hadn't bothered to ask about her position, her background, her life. He had treated her like any other person in his court, without considering that there was far more to her than he could see in a single moment. Realization flooded over him in waves. He had not only made a mistake in his ruling, but he had also failed to recognize the impact of that mistake. Harris wasn't just another defendant. She was a leader, a trailblazer. And now he was faced with the awkward reality of his error, one that had the potential to cause significant fallout, not just for Harris, but for the legal system as a whole. Immediately, Ellis's mind began to race with thoughts of how to address the situation. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could at least try to make amends. His first instinct was to retract the fine, to make sure that her record wasn't marred by something so trivial. But he knew that wasn't enough. This was more than just a correction. It was a matter of respect. In the hours that followed, Ellis found himself grappling with something deeper. The fine had been a symptom of a much larger issue. The assumption that authority and recognition were reserved for those who fit a particular mold. He had assumed, simply by looking at Harris, that she was just another person in a long line of traffic violations. He had missed an opportunity to learn, to grow, to recognize someone for who they truly were. That evening, Ellis sat at his desk, reflecting on his actions. He knew what he had to do. He would have to apologize, not just for the fine, but for the ignorance and the assumptions that had led him to make that judgment in the first place. The first step would be reaching out to Harris directly, but he knew it would take more than a few words to make things right. Judge Thomas Ellis sat at his desk long after the courthouse had closed, his thoughts consumed by the events of the day. The realization of his mistake gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't let this situation go unaddressed. What had seemed like a simple traffic case had turned into a glaring example of his own biases, a moment where he had failed to recognize the significance of the person standing before him. He took a deep breath and began to write a letter. The words didn't come easily, but he knew they had to be sincere. He had never been one to shy away from responsibility, and this was no different. What had happened wasn't just a minor error. It was a matter of respect, recognition, and fairness. And if there was one thing Judge Ellis believed in, it was the integrity of the legal system. He had failed to uphold that integrity today, but he was determined to make things right. The letter was simple but direct. Dear Lieutenant Colonel Harris, I am writing to express my deepest apologies for the error I made during your recent appearance in my courtroom. Upon reflection, I realized that I not only misjudged your situation, but I also failed to recognize the remarkable person you are. It was an oversight that I deeply regret, and I want to acknowledge that I have made a mistake in treating you as just another defendant in a routine case. You are a leader, a highly respected officer in the military justice system, and someone whose contributions to the armed forces cannot be overstated. I should have recognized that immediately, and I failed to do so. For this, I am truly sorry. I understand the importance of respect and recognition, not only in the courtroom but also in our society at large. I want to assure you that I will take steps to ensure this mistake is never repeated, both in my personal actions and in how I approach cases going forward. I also want to make it clear that the fine issued in your case is hereby retracted, and I apologize for the inconvenience and distress it may have caused you. Please accept my sincere apology. I hope we can move forward with mutual respect and understanding. Sincerely, Judge Thomas Ellis. Ellis stared at the letter for a moment, unsure of what kind of response to expect. He had drafted and redrafted it several times, each revision bringing him closer to the words he felt he needed to say. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, but he hoped the sincerity of his apology would be evident. With a final glance, he hit send. He wasn't sure how Harris would respond, but he understood that actions spoke louder than words. This was just the first step in a much longer process of learning and growth. Still, it felt like a necessary one, a small but significant gesture of accountability. Meanwhile, across town, Lieutenant Colonel Harris was sitting in her office, focused on preparing for another round of military briefings. Her phone buzzed, and when she saw the message from Judge Ellis, she paused. She had been expecting something, perhaps even dreading it, but the apology came with an unexpected sincerity. She read it carefully, taking in each word. For a moment, she sat in silence, letting the weight of the message sink in. Then, with a calm resolve, she set the phone down. This wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about moving forward, learning from each other, and ensuring that respect was something earned and given in equal measure. The letter from Judge Ellis was an unexpected turn in an otherwise straightforward day for Lieutenant Colonel Angela Harris. She had been preparing for a crucial briefing with military leaders when she saw the email pop up on her phone. At first, she hesitated. She had been busy, focused on the task at hand, but something about the sincerity of the message pulled her in. She read it carefully, appreciating the humility in Ellis's words. While she didn't expect to be showered with praise, the fact that he had acknowledged his mistake and taken responsibility for it was something she respected. Harris had spent much of her career navigating systems that often overlooked people like her, people of color, women in leadership roles, individuals who didn't fit the traditional mold. But she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about the larger message of accountability, respect, and the need for greater awareness in how people viewed authority and leadership. After a moment of contemplation, she picked up her phone and responded with a simple, direct message. *Thank you for your apology. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge your mistake. I believe we can learn from this and move forward in a positive direction. It wasn't an invitation for further conversation, but it was an acknowledgement of his efforts to make things right. It was the kind of response that, in Harris's mind, was a step toward change, not just for herself, but for others who might be treated in similar ways. She then set the phone down and turned her focus back to the briefing. Meanwhile, Judge Ellis, who had anxiously awaited her response, breathed a sigh of relief when he saw her message. It wasn't the kind of reaction that expected forgiveness or even gratitude, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. Harris wasn't looking for anything more than an understanding of the mistake, and she had made it clear that she was willing to move forward. Ellis, however, knew that this exchange wasn't the end of the matter. It was just the beginning of his own journey toward deeper self-awareness and growth. A few days later, Ellis reached out again, this time requesting a face-to-face meeting with Harris. It wasn't just about further apologies. He genuinely wanted to learn from her, to hear about her experiences, and to understand how he could do better. He knew he had a lot to learn. When the day of the meeting arrived, Ellis entered a quiet conference room, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Harris was already seated, her posture as composed as ever. She looked up as he entered and gave a small nod in acknowledgement. There was no tension in the room, only the unspoken understanding that they were both there to make things right. "Thank you for meeting with me," Ellis began, his voice steady but respectful. "I realize this may not be the easiest conversation to have, but I truly want to understand how I can be better." Harris looked at him for a moment, considering his words. She appreciated the fact that Ellis was willing to engage in the conversation, and she knew that moments like these, conversations between people from different worlds, were rare. They both sat there, not as judge and officer, but as two people willing to listen and learn from one another. Harris began by sharing her experiences, how difficult it had been to rise through the ranks as a woman of color, how often she had been underestimated or misjudged, not just by civilians, but sometimes by her own peers. She spoke with clarity, not bitterness, but with a quiet strength that came from years of navigating a world that had never fully recognized her for who she was. Ellis listened intently, reflecting on her words. He knew that this conversation, while difficult, was an opportunity for both of them to grow. It was a chance to bridge the gap between their worlds and truly understand the complexity of each other's roles. In the end, the meeting wasn't just about an apology. It was about breaking down barriers, both personal and institutional. Harris had taught Ellis something he couldn't have learned in any textbook or seminar. And for Harris, the conversation wasn't about proving a point. It was about moving forward with the hope that both of them, in their own way, would continue to strive for a more just and equitable world. As they parted ways that day, they knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. What had begun as a mistake had now become a learning experience, one that would shape both of their futures in ways they hadn't anticipated. In the weeks that followed the meeting, the story of the courtroom incident began to take on a new dimension. The military community, initially shocked by the oversight, had witnessed a remarkable transformation. A judge had acknowledged his mistake, and a respected military officer had shown grace in moving forward. What had started as a moment of tension was now an example of accountability, humility, and the power of meaningful dialogue. For Judge Ellis, the experience had been eye-opening. He had spent years on the bench, but it wasn't until he faced the truth of his own biases that he understood the full weight of his actions. He began to approach his cases with a greater awareness, making a concerted effort to learn more about the individuals before him, not just their legal situations, but their lives. In his personal reflections, he often thought of Harris's words about being seen for who you truly are. He realized that, like many others, he had been blind to the complexities of the people he interacted with daily, especially those who didn't fit the stereotypes or the typical profiles that he was used to. Ellis wasn't the only one who had been changed by the encounter. Harris, too, found herself reflecting on the event and what it had meant for her. The encounter had stirred up emotions she hadn't expected. Frustration, certainly, but also a reminder of the long road she had traveled to reach where she was. As a woman of color in a male-dominated institution like the military, she had faced challenges at every step. But the apology and the conversation with Ellis reinforced something she had always believed. Progress wasn't always linear, and it didn't always come in the form she expected. Sometimes, it came through unexpected moments of connection and understanding. Harris also became more vocal in sharing her experiences. She started to give talks at military forums, encouraging others to confront their biases and build bridges with those they might not immediately understand. Her story became a powerful example of resilience, not only in her career, but in her efforts to foster real, substantive change in the system. She wasn't just a figure of authority in the courtroom. She was now a symbol of the power of learning from mistakes and moving forward with purpose. As for Judge Ellis, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility. He had always believed in the law, but now he believed in something more. He believed in the power of empathy and the importance of making sure that those who stood before him were treated with the respect they deserved, no matter their rank or background. He worked to make sure that his courtroom was one where everyone, regardless of their identity, felt seen and heard. In the end, the fine, though a small incident in the grand scheme of things, had sparked a deeper change, one that neither Ellis nor Harris could have predicted. It had brought two individuals from different worlds together, leading them both to understand that change begins with small steps, with one conversation, with one apology. And sometimes, the most unexpected moments can be the ones that lead to the most profound transformations. Lieutenant Colonel Angela Harris had returned to her work, the fine behind her, but the lessons from that experience stayed with her. It had become clear that both she and Judge Ellis had learned something valuable that day. That respect was earned, that understanding was built, and that even the most routine moments could be the beginning of something new. For both of them, The journey was far from over, but it was a journey that together they had begun. One rooted in honesty, humility, and the willingness to change. And that perhaps was the most important victory of all.